Well, welcome back to the Flawed podcast, everybody. This is episode 26 in our little mini-series on why Jesus had to die. In the last episode, I gave this very detailed breakdown of how those who hold to penal substitutionary atonement use the law of Moses as supportive evidence to show that a legal punishment of sins is necessary for our forgiveness of sins. Now, I'm not going to give you all a review of that because we have so much content to cover today, but if you didn't get a chance to listen to last week's episode, you need to do that because that episode sets up the foundation for everything that we're going to be talking about today and over the next few episodes in this mini-series when we're talking about the law and how the law relates to Jesus' death on the cross. So definitely check that out if you haven't done that before you listen to this episode. Now for today, we're going to move forward to show you just how the law came into being, how it got there in the first place, and what different cultural and historic considerations that many of us in the church do not take into account when we look at the law. Then we're going to take another episode or two and break apart what God's real intention in giving the law was, and how Jesus in the New Testament reveals a more accurate picture of what the law was actually supposed to drive us to do when those who were under it were convicted by it. Now, if we're going to go all the way back to the reason why God gave the law in the first place, we actually have to go forward and first talk about Jesus. And let me explain to you why. Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 6 says, "Blessed be God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us in Christ with every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places, even as he chose us in him," in Christ, right? "Before the foundations of the world, that we should be holy and blameless before him in love. He predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will, to the praise of his glorious grace, with which he has blessed us in the beloved." And there's a lot of other passages like this that I can cite, but the New Testament makes it very clear that from the beginning, even before the universe was formed, God's plan for humankind was to be in Jesus, to be conformed to his image, to be adopted unto himself through the birthing of Jesus' identical spiritual DNA in us, through that born from above, born again experience that I talked about in other episodes. See, that was God's plan all along from the very beginning. I mean, Colossians says in chapter 1 that Jesus in us, Christ in us, was God's mystery, hidden from all the ages in the former time, but now revealed to us in these last days. And Revelation chapter 13 says that Jesus is the Lamb of God who is slain before the foundations of the world. You see, all that to say is that anything in the Bible other than Jesus living in us comes up short. Anything other than Jesus is insufficient. And anything other than Jesus is not God's perfect plan. Emphasis on perfect. Being one and in relationship with Jesus, that is the plan. He's the fullness of God's glory. In us, there's no substitute, there's no addition. The Apostle Paul says in Romans 10, verse 4, that Christ is the end, which means the culmination, the fulfillment of the law. The buck stops with the person of Jesus. So when we open the pages of the Bible to anything else that comes before Jesus, anything before Jesus came to earth, as recorded to us in the Gospels, or like the Old Testament, we have to understand the proper context and purpose of those things. Because anything in the Bible, including the law, that's supposed to bring us to Jesus and bring us only to him, not a mixture of the two. Now, this was something that was never explained to me as a kid growing up in the church. You see, I took the whole Bible as a flat, surface level, throw it all in together and see what you come up with, soup pot revelation and perfect will and perfect picture of God. Which means I took everything from the book of Genesis and all the pages of the Bible all the way up to the time of Jesus, including the law of Moses, as stuff that reflected the nature and character of God perfectly. That everything that God said and did in the Old Testament was an exact representation of who God was and how things work in the heavenlies. I thought that because, well, God is perfect, right? If so, then shouldn't everything written in the Bible be a perfect reflection of God? And if that's the case, then there's really no need to go beyond a surface level reading or understanding of the text. I mean, right? If God said it or did it in the Old Testament, well, then that must be exactly what God wanted. It must be exactly who He is. If God revealed something in the Old Testament or handed something down in the Old Testament, like that Mosaic law, well, then that must be exactly how God wanted it to be and who God is at His core being. I mean, that's what I thought. Now, I actually still do believe that to be partially true. I really do. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that at the end of this episode. But there's also another part of the understanding that I do not believe is accurate. And as I talk about that today concerning the law of Moses, it's really going to give us a different way of how we understand humankind's, or how we interpret the Bible story of humanity that takes place after humans or our fall in Genesis chapter 3. Because that's really the crux of where this whole Bible story starts, Genesis chapter 3, and the problem with sin and that God has to deal with. You know, it's really, if we look at it a different way, it's really going to give us a different way of how we understand what we see God doing in giving the Ten Commandments to Israelites in that book of Exodus, and how the Mosaic law plays out up until the time of Jesus. That's what I'm hoping we're going to be able to see and provide you an alternate view as we look at the giving of the law of Moses a little different way here. Oh, and lastly, because I target these podcasts for a wide variety of audience, I don't know where people are at and where they're coming from as far as how they look at the Old Testament. But for me, it doesn't matter whether you are taking the stories in the Old Testament as a literal historical account, or if you're looking at the Old Testament as the early church father Origen did, for example, as it being some type of an allegory. But either way, Jesus shows that there's no doubt that God entered into this Old Testament story. That God came, or that God coming to us in the person of Jesus, it came through this ancient Jewish story. And because Jesus showed us that, He affirmed that, we too have to understand what went on in that Old Testament if we want to really be able to understand what God is trying to say to us through it. All right, so as we enter into this Old Testament narrative right now, we're going to view it as God-inspired stories and God-inspired events. And that these events are set upon a very specific timeline that we need to understand, because it's God who used these stories and these events and this timeline to bring Jesus into the world. You can't separate Jesus from the story He grew up out of, right? And recall how the Apostle Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 10 that all this stuff was written down for our example. And in 2 Timothy 3:16 that all Old Testament scripture is God-breathed. It's breathed out by God, and it's profitable for teaching and reproof and for correction and for training in righteousness. So therefore, we're going to follow the Apostle Paul's lead here and hit the Old Testament story head on, so we can see how this biblical story shows the law coming into existence. And then we're going to look and see how Jesus in the New Testament, how they reframe the law in a way that I believe is much different than how most of us in the church were led to understand it. So prepare yourselves, for some of you maybe for the first time even, to see the law in a different light. And so let's move on to the review of this biblical narrative for how we even got the law. And let me give you 3 words that are going to set up this whole history. Fallen cultural conditioning. All right, in the opening pages of Genesis, the story gives us a picture that everything was rightly oriented with everything else. I mean, everything was in peace and harmony, and there wasn't any bloodshed, there wasn't any violence, and so forth. Yet in this paradise, God gives humankind the ability to make free choices. We see this empowerment of free choice in the narrative, in the Bible story, when it says that God placed two trees in the Garden of Eden. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God tells Adam and Eve that, hey, you guys can do whatever you want. Eat from whatever tree. But just don't eat from that tree of good and evil. Stay away from it. Don't do it. You'll regret it. That's God's message to them. And then later, a talking snake appears to Adam and Eve. And this serpent, he later gets associated as a personification of Satan and the devil in the New Testament. And this snake of a person lies to them and tells them that God lied to them and convinces them that God never had their best interests in mind when he told them not to eat of that tree. And he was only protecting himself out of fear when he issued that warning. Because, God didn't want you to be like him, so that's why he gave that warning. Well, that was convincing enough material, so both the man and the woman ate of some of that fruit of this not so good tree. And the text says in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, that their eyes, all of a sudden, after this event, after they ate this, their eyes were opened. And then they knew that they were naked. And it goes on to say that they sewed fig leaves together and made some, makeshift underwear to clothe themselves. But then, guys, they hear the sound of God coming in the garden. And so they run and they hide and try and shield themselves from God's presence. Now I got to stop there, because even though we are only in the middle of the 3rd chapter of the Bible, this is the key moment that the entire Bible is based upon. Right here. The whole thing, literally, the whole reason that the Bible sets up the need for Jesus to come, all comes down to this, folks, right here. And it's all about the matter of sin. We're going to come back to the story when I share with you about my view as to why Jesus had to die on the cross and why his death was necessary to bring us the forgiveness of sins. And when I do, I'll bring out some more parts of the story to make my points. But what I want to show you in mentioning the story now, it's the problem that sin created here. The whole biblical story comes down to this idea about the knowledge of good and evil. Because that's the very thing that God was trying to protect them from. The main issue here, folks, it's not as a devil proposed in that God was trying to prevent them from knowing good and evil as like this abstract principle, like knowing right from wrong, right? I mean, God already told them what was right from wrong. It's right to eat of anything else in the garden, and it's wrong to eat of this tree, right? I mean, you follow me? So right and wrong, that really wasn't the issue here. The issue was judging for yourself what is good and what is evil. To make the distinction of good and evil using your own human understanding rather than trusting God. Judging right, or what is right and wrong, from your own point of view, from your own person's sense of right and wrong, instead of believing what God says. That's what the real issue is about, being the judge. And we see this playing out right away in 2 ways. After judging for themselves that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was a good thing, and rather than a bad thing, as God told them was, they now see for the first time that they're naked. Being naked wasn't such a bad thing at all. I mean, they'd been naked the whole time with God, but now they're judging for themselves. And they judge nakedness incorrectly, believing that, I should be ashamed for being in that condition. And then when they hear God's voice, they judge incorrectly again and believe that they should be afraid of him, and they go and hide themselves. 2 bad judgments, back to back. See, what sin does is it puts us in the position of judging what is wrong and what's right, instead of letting God be the judge. Because of sin, humans are now thinking that we know what's right or wrong, and that we ourselves can judge between the good and the bad. And this brings a loss of dependency on God and a loss of relationship with God. And what happens with that, we now put our own self-centered wants and desires above others and believe that to be right, when that is actually evil. That's the whole issue with self-centeredness. I mean, that is the heart of sin. Judging that things that further our own self-benefit, at whatever the cost to others, becomes the highest priority and right in our own eyes. And this event in the Bible, right here in chapter 3, my friends, is the beginning of the downfall of the human condition. And that narrative plays out for the rest of the whole Bible. The story of Adam and Eve's fall, it's like one of the top 3 stories of the entire, and foundational stories of the Bible. I mean, you can summarize the whole Bible from the consequence of this one story. I could quote and summarize the Bible as this: the Bible is the long and painful story of how God tries to bring humankind back into a similar relationship with God that they had in the Garden of Eden before Adam and Eve's fall. And God does this so that they can be freed, or wants to do this so that they can be freed from their brokenness and their self-centeredness and all the evil that sin produces in the world. I mean, that's basically the whole story of the Bible. And I am talking about the law here, so just follow with me as I set this up. Now, the eventual remedy and answer to this huge problem with sin, as I already said, was going to be found in restored relation with God and spiritually birthing them with God's own heart and nature through Jesus. God's grand plan for doing this was, like I said, through the incarnation of God himself in the person of Jesus. That would draw them back to them and give them a spiritual new birth so they could get free from their sin. That was and still is God's grand answer to humanity's problem with sin, which, according to the biblical narrative here, that's the problem, or it's that problem that started way back in Genesis chapter 3 in the Garden of Eden. Sure, and that might sound fine and dandy, but the next thing we see in the story is that Jesus doesn't come into the picture right away after Adam and Eve's sin. According to this biblical narrative, it takes a couple thousand years until Jesus comes to free humanity from sin. And I don't have time to go into why I think it took that long for Jesus to come, but the fact that it did brings us to my next question and my response. A question and response that's going to get at the heart of what I'm trying to convey in this episode. Jesus was prepared before the foundations of the world to free humankind from sin. And because Jesus doesn't come for a few thousand years after sin enters the world, the question is this: what is God going to do with human beings and their sin in the meantime until God can deal with their sin in the person of Jesus? I mean, that's a great question, isn't it? If Jesus, if he's the solution, then how do you handle this huge problem with sin until the solution comes? Well, what God does in the meantime is he creates a pathway for Jesus to come through building a special called out people who maintain faith in him. So that through this faith and this physical lineage, God can send Jesus, the Messiah, through them, in hopes to bring the whole world back into relationship with him and save them from their destructive sins. This means, folks, that everything that happens after Adam and Eve's fall in Genesis chapter 3, all the way through the Old Testament until the time of Jesus, that's only a holding pattern to bring us to Jesus. That's right, folks. Those are just temporary measures, like sticking your finger in a hole in a boat until you get to shore and you can put a permanent fix in it. We're going to read a passage from the book of Galatians later where the Apostle Paul says the exact same thing when he refers to the 10 Commandments and the Mosaic Law as being just a temporary, imperfect, stopgap measure until Jesus comes. But before we skip ahead to the law, folks, I have to talk a little bit more about the history in the Bible that takes place before the law was even given to Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai. I mean, there's some super important historical and cultural considerations that we can't overlook if you're going to understand this fallen cultural conditioning that was already in place and that God entered into when the law was given. So let me share that. After Adam and Eve sin in Genesis chapter 3, God lets all of humanity just go to their own devices, to go their own way. Humanity creates their own cultures, their own origin stories, their own practices, their own religions, their own gods, false narratives about how to please and appease and how to have a relationship with these gods. And they also form their own social and communal laws and concepts of justice. And my point being, God lets them all do this apart from Him. Yeah, humans, they now have the knowledge of good and evil because they ate of the tree, but they don't have the capacity to judge good or evil correctly. Just as Isaiah chapter 5 verse 20 says, "Woe to those who call good evil and evil good, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who puts bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." And you see, since humans can't lovingly judge what is truly wrong and what's truly right, because they're only looking after their own interests, their own self-centeredness, their own pride and greed and lust of the flesh and lust of their eyes, all hell starts to break out on the earth. Humanity now pursues their own interests, and they set up their structures completely opposite of the self-sacrificial nature of the love of God. This is what we see, folks, happening in Genesis chapter 4 through chapter 11. In fact, these human systems and structures get so bad that a flood comes to wipe everything out. And then after that, what we see is a scattering of all the people at the Tower of Babel across the earth because their aspirations are so out of line with God that something needed to be done in order to preserve God's plan to send Jesus to the earth. Now, all those stories of what happens between Genesis chapter 4 and 11, I mean, that's a whole deep ocean of theology that I don't have to get into in this episode, but I'm pointing that out to show you that the narrative, the Bible's narrative, shows God allowing for humans to create their own systems of government, allowing humans to create their own structures, and allowing humans to create their own social practices and their own gods, their own religions, their own cultures, their own laws, and their own sense of justice. God allows them to do that in ways that don't reflect the love of God. That's how God let go. Do you see that? The systems found within all the people groups of the world after the Garden of Eve, and after the flood, and after the Tower of Babel, they do not reflect God's nature and God's systems. None of them do. They don't reflect God's will, and they do not reflect the character of Jesus Christ. None of them. No. God gave them up to do their own thing. And you can read about how God gives them up to do their own things in the first chapter of Romans. That's what that's all about, how God just says, all right, well, you want to do things apart from me? Well, I'm not going to force you to follow my way. And that's exactly what they do. However, which is the fundamental point of this episode, because God allows this free will of humankind to play out and proliferate its evil ways on the earth, the false beliefs and systems they create, you see, that's all God has to work with if God's going to work with humanity to bring them back to Him. It's all He got. And when God begins to build a people of faith to bring them back to Him through the eventual coming of Jesus, He does not violate their free will, nor does He override their own fallen cultural conditioning to do so. Man, do you get that? This is so fundamental that I really want to make sure you get this. This means that God had to enter into their stories, take upon their narratives, their false pictures about him, their false ideas about love, justice, their false ideas about how law should work and how justice works. And he tries to transform these fallen cultural conditionings from the inside out. Yep, those are those three little words I mentioned earlier, the fallen cultural conditionings. And because God works within fallen cultural conditioning, even things that are fallen about himself, notions and ideas about God that are incorrect, like the world and how love works and justice and laws and so on, this leads to some pretty erroneous pictures of God in the Old Testament. And this is easy to see because much of what we see in the Old Testament, it does not line up with the character and nature and picture of God that was revealed perfectly in the person of Jesus. And these erroneous depictions of God throughout the Old Testament continue all the way through the biblical narrative until Jesus brings the full revelation of God to the first century world. And wow, there's a lot of erroneous pictures of God in the Old Testament that we could point out and talk about. But we're trying to get to the Mosaic Law for this episode. So let me continue to build this story into how that came into being. And yes, you can tell where I'm going here. But we're going to see that the law is also one of these fallen systems that God enters into in order to work with the people and where they're at. Now, here's the context of the Mosaic Law that I want to bring out that no one ever taught me about when I was learning about the Bible and about the love of God in Jesus Christ. Yes, God allowed humanity to do their own thing after the fall in Genesis 3. That's the biblical story. That's why all these cultures had aspects about them that do not look like Jesus, right? It's easy to list them off. They had slavery in their cultures. They had animal and child sacrifices. It's hideous. Wars. They had bloodshed and violence and treating women like property. And they had rights that only favored the elite. And so on. I mean, there's nasty stuff that goes on in these cultures of the ancient Near East world. And included in all that cultural brokenness, they also create their own moral, their own ethical and judicial systems and their own laws and codes. They do this completely independent of God. Which makes sense because God gave them up to do their own thing. Now, I'm sure if that makes sense to you when I say that, I would bet money that many of you have not correlated that with God's giving of the Mosaic Law. You see, all these cultures that spread across the earth after the scattering at the Tower of Babel, they all developed their own moral and their own ethical and judicial laws and codes. And they developed that long before, get this, long before God ever gave the Mosaic Law at Mount Sinai. And what's cool right here around this Tower of Babel, right here in chapters 10 with the Table of Nations and chapter 11 with the Tower of Babel, and the beginning of chapter 12 in Genesis, this is where we can see a real intersection of the story of the Bible with our actual records of ancient history. I mean, whether you believe all the contents about the creation story up to the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 are literal or not, we know from archaeological evidence that the cultures that emerged and are named in Genesis 11, a lot of them really did exist in the ancient Near East. I mean, isn't that cool? Like the Canaanites, the Egyptians, and various people in Mesopotamia, the Hittites, the Amorites, and so on. We have evidence of those people actually existing. And here's the thing, guys. All of these ancient Near Eastern cultures had their own moral and their own ethical and judicial laws and systems and codes before the Israelites ever reached Mount Sinai and received the Mosaic Law. Heck, they had all this stuff going on before the Israelites were even enslaved in Egypt. Hammurabi's code was already in operation in Babylonia. The laws of Eshnunna in Mesopotamia were already set up during this same time. The Hittite and Middle Assyrian laws were already in existence during this time. And these laws and these codes, they were not cut off and isolated from the rest of the region and the different peoples in that ancient Near East area. All this information, these false narratives about the gods and these false narratives about laws and how justice should work, it was all shared in the ancient Near East because of the Fertile Crescent. Now, some of you might remember that term from your high school geography lessons, and I had forgotten all about it until I went to Israel a couple years ago, and I was on a bus tour with a bunch of partying senior citizens way back in 2018. But on one of the first days of that trip, our tour guide pulled out this large map and re-explained why the Fertile Crescent was so important in the development of Israel's ancient history. I mean, the Fertile Crescent is this huge, wide swath of very productive and fertile land that stretched from the northern area of Egypt along the coast of the Mediterranean up through Israel and up through modern-day Lebanon and Syria, and then back across the east, stretching all the way down through ancient Babylon and Mesopotamia, all the way through where Iraq and Kuwait are now. It was a massive trading route between all these people groups of the ancient Near East. And because of that, cultures were exchanged, ideas were exchanged, societal values and different ways of viewing the world were exchanged. Different religions were exchanged. Different ideas about how the spiritual world, how that intersected with the physical world were exchanged, and so on. And the land that would later become known as the land of Israel, which is this really strip of land that traders and sojourners had to pass through if you're going to trade through the Fertile Crescent, that was a very significant piece of land because it was heavily visited and influenced by this exchange of cultures. You had to go through that little strip of land. And the exchange of cultures, that would have influenced the ancient Israelites about their sense of morality, their sense of justice and honor and ethics, and all that would have happened long before their time in Egypt. Right? I mean, there's no doubt they would have had absorbed those traditions and those influences of the Egyptian people when they were slaves in Egypt for 400 years. I mean, heck, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, are attributed to an author who had not even been born until after the Israelites were in Egypt for a couple hundred years. So keep that history all in mind, this exchange of fallen cultural conditioning all throughout the ancient years. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about how we receive the law and the Ten Commandments. I'm getting close to getting to my grand point here, so stick with me. Now, moving beyond chapter 11 in Genesis and that global dispersion that happened at the Tower of Babel, and that global dispersion that they went out and created out their own moral and their own judicial codes and laws unique to their own culture. Finally, in Genesis chapter 12, we see God speaking to a man named Abram. Abram is later renamed Abraham, and it's here that we have to know a little bit about Abraham before we talk about how he relates to this fallen cultural conditioning stuff. You see, Abraham isn't some random person that just dropped out of the sky. We'd be wrong to think of him as some person who is free from sin and free from all this fallen cultural conditioning that had affected all the people of the earth after Genesis chapter 3, right? You see, the book of Genesis says that Abraham grew up, got married, and lived in the land of Ur, which is way down in that farthest southern eastern side of the Fertile Crescent in what now is like southern Iraq or Kuwait. Probably not Kuwait, but way down there, right? So of course, Abraham grew up with entirely false ideas about who God was, and entirely inaccurate ideas about what was wrong and what was right. just like all the people of earth did, since God let them go to do what was right in their own eyes. And as Abraham grew up in a system, he grew up in a system that was more than likely already had developed their own codes and laws and ethics for how a community was supposed to be governed and how to handle community injustices. It was already there. Abraham was already culturally conditioned because of the environment he grew up in. And secondly, Abraham's cultural conditioning, it extended beyond his own indigenous culture, because at some point after he was married, his father Terah took his family along with Abraham, all the family, and moved hundreds and hundreds of miles across the Fertile Crescent and resettled in the land of Canaan, which is modern Israel today. So not only did Abraham have this fallen conditioning, cultural conditioning from his own native geographical region that he was born and raised in, he was then uprooted, thrown into another geographical melting pot region with their own fallen cultural conditioning about the ways of God and about the ways of justice, right? The ways of how laws work. Now just hold that thought a second. Here's one more thing about Abraham. Since Adam and Eve's fall in Genesis chapter 3, the whole world had been in free fall. People have been doing their own thing. And even though God worked with Noah for a short time after the flood story comes to close in Genesis 10, there's no direct lineage of a people of God after Genesis chapter 10. There's no passage in those chapters, like chapter 10, 11, that says, and these specific people preserved a faithful and accurate witness to the living God Yahweh and did everything right and had no pagan influences on their culture or on their laws or no pagan influences on their sense of justice. No, they all went astray. That's the story of the Bible. They all had misunderstandings about God and misconceptions about Him. They all did their own separate things with their own cultures and their own practices developing independent of God. And there's a really important reason why I'm saying all this. We'll get to that in a second. So in Genesis chapter 12, where God speaks to Abraham with an invitation to follow him, God is in essence trying to break into humanity from complete scratch, folks. And not only is God starting from scratch with revealing himself to humankind and helping to prepare the way for Jesus to come through them, and starting with Abraham, God was going to have to enter into all of Abraham's fallen, sinful, and inaccurate ideas about God. Like, yikes, human sacrifices, because that's what they all did back then. Animal sacrifices, because that's what they all did back then. God had to enter into all these fallen ideas of the roles of women, right? And slavery, because that's what they did back then. That was their system. Yada, yada, yada. And God was having to enter into those to work through them. Not because God was like any of those things, but God had to use them where they're at. And specifically for this podcast, God was going to have to work through all of Abraham's fallen cultural conditioning about ethical and moral and judicial laws that had already been in place in the surrounding cultures before God called Abraham. Whew. Now, I know that's a lot, but it's entirely true. Now, in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham responds in faith towards God's call. And because of that faith, God chooses Abraham and uses his physical lineage to build and maintain a people of faith who will physically bring forth the Messiah, Jesus, who will then reveal who God really is. And he would do that to the whole world. And God chooses Abraham not because Abraham's special or because he knows more truth about Yahweh or because Abraham knows how to judge between right and wrong correctly, or that somehow because Abraham knows how to judge between good and bad. No, none of that. That's not why God chooses Abraham. God chooses Abraham because he maintains faith in a relationship with God. And folks, what this means is that the entire nation of Israel was already being based upon and built on a fallen cultural conditioning that did not represent who God was. Do you see that? That's such an important point to make that no one ever explained to me. God didn't take Abraham and give him a cultural enema and miraculously just remove all the fallen ideas that he had about the world and had about God. No, God did not lobotomize Abraham and infuse him with supernatural revelation knowledge with all the correct ideas about God, about how to do the sacrifices, about how to keep the right laws, about, what does God need to be appeased and so forth. No, that's not how God works. Rather, God entered into Abraham's fallen cultural conditioning and did that to change it from the inside out and slowly over time. God chose Abraham because of his faith, fully well knowing that Abraham had false pictures about him and had false cultural systems in place that did not line up with God's best. They didn't line up with God's best by a long shot. But if God's plan all along was to save humanity by incarnating himself through humanity in the person of Jesus, well, God had to start somewhere, right? I'm going to show you two quick and really very clear examples of this fallen cultural conditioning that God enters into with the person of Abraham. The first one is right after Abraham is said to have believed God. This is in Genesis 15, where Abraham believes God's promises and God accredits to Abraham's account as being righteous. After Abraham believes God, God enters into this covenant ceremony with Abraham. You can read this in Genesis 15. This ceremony is a bloody and murderous ceremony with taking precious and beloved animals and cutting them in half and laying the two pieces of dead animal meat across from each other, which left a walking space in between all these halved and slaughtered animals. To us, that just sounds cruel. And after this deep sleep falls upon Abraham, God comes to Abraham in a vision, reaffirms his promise that he just made to Abraham. And God symbolically walks between all these halved, dead animals in the form of a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch. Now, if someone reads this passage today, we think, what the heck is this junk? Why would God do this? Is he trying to tell us that God is violent and that God needs and enjoys and rejoices in killing animals to make promises? Is this how God's methodology works in heaven? If God's going to make an agreement, he has to have blood? But what many of us were never taught, including me, was that this type of ceremony, guys, this was already in place around these ancient Near East communities and these cultures. In the Middle Assyrian and Hittite cultural treaties were established by these types of cutting ceremonies. The participants walked between the divided animal pieces as a symbolic curse, like saying, "May I become like one of these animals if I ever violate this covenant agreement that I've made between you and me." And there's a lot I could say about this covenant ceremony going on between God and Abraham in Genesis 15, but the point I'm making here is that it's a great example how God enters into that fallen cultural conditioning to work with the people. No, God doesn't want to kill animals, nor does he need dead animals to enter into relationship with people. He's the giver of life, not the taker. But God picked up on these practices that Abraham and all the cultures around him would have been accustomed to, and he entered into them. And by doing so, God entered into that sin that they contained, and he appears to be sinful himself just to be in relationship with them and to hopefully, in time, bring truth to these fallen ideas and practices and get them out of them. Okay, now the second example or instance of Abraham and God entering into these fallen cultural practices is when there's this offering of his son Isaac as a sacrifice. Now, I don't have time to go through this whole story either, but I do have 3 20-minute videos on my website at theflowers.com that goes through that whole story, and you can check that out if you want to listen to that. But one of the aspects of that story that I want to bring out is that God once again enters into Abraham's fallen cultural belief. Because many people, who knows, maybe all, I don't know, but many people of the ancient Near East believed that the gods need a child sacrifice in order to be appeased. Now, how is God going to correct this horrible, false idea? Well, God flips the whole narrative by entering into the story and teaching Abraham that this new God who appeared to him, this Yahweh, does not want child sacrifices or any type of human sacrifices at all. That's what God tries to teach Abraham. He does this pretty much right away in the story of God entering in to work with humanity here after Genesis 3. God does this by having Abraham go through what appears to be a regular old child sacrifice ceremony, something that would have seemed totally normal to Abraham or anyone else living back then, only to instead provide a ram for the sacrifice that was caught in the thicket, and to offer that instead of offering Isaac. See, God slams the door on human or child sacrifices. So those are just 2 ways that we see God using and entering into pre-existing cultural conditioning, even though it's fallen and does not represent God at all. He does this in order to bring truth slowly over time. I mean, that might seem like a horribly slow and ineffective method, and I agree. But if you're a God who doesn't use coercion and you don't use force or sheer power to get your way, then that might be the only way to get people to change their minds. Right? And this is why I believe we see so much ugliness in the Old Testament with violence and with treating women as property and giving them a very low status in the social realm. And why we see the Old Testament's allowance for slavery and polygamy and divorce and allowances for harsh treatment towards those who would fall into the LGBT community today and so on. Folks, the Old Testament has some really ugly pictures of it that do not reflect the nature and character of Jesus. But that's not because the Old Testament reflects a harsher side of God, or that the Old Testament reflects a more fuller picture of God that Jesus didn't somehow display when he was on earth. I mean, some believe that, but I don't. I believe that Jesus is the full picture of God. But because God's not coercive or forceful and he doesn't use power over to control and get his way, he enters into this fallen cultural conditioning of the people that he works with in order to turn the situation around from the inside out. Because God is love, and love is the only real hope to changing the world. And we're going to find God using the same principle in giving the Mosaic law. Now, I know it's taken me a long time, almost to the end of this podcast, to get there, to talk about the law specifically, but I hope giving you all this historical and cultural context is helping you see the point that I'm making. We're almost done with this episode, so let's continue in the story of what happens after Abraham. Now, coming out of Abraham's lineage, that's his son Isaac, and then Isaac's son Jacob, whose name is later changed to Israel, and that's where we get the name the Israelites. Then Jacob has 12 sons, and that's where the family subdivides into 12 tribes, and where we get these 12 tribes of Israel. And all of Abraham's extended family, they're all living in that narrow strip of land that we know as modern Israel in the Fertile Crescent, until we get to the story of Joseph. Joseph is the second to last of Jacob's 12 sons, and many of you probably know the story of Joseph. He has this coat of many colors that his father gives him. These brothers get jealous, and he has these visions too, and his brothers get jealous of that and kind of says some things out of his mouth that he probably wants back. But Joseph gets sold into slavery, and he's then taken to Egypt, and he's got his own problems down there, but he eventually becomes this high up ruler among the Egyptians. And after Joseph gains power and influence, he brings a whole family of the Israelites to Egypt to save them from this famine that was occurring in the land. But only after a few generations following Joseph's death, all the Israelites and descendants of Abraham, they become slaves in Egypt. And not that I need to mention it, but you know where I'm going to go here, because of course when the Israelites are enslaved in Egypt for these 400 plus years, they're picking up and they're being ingrained with all of the Egyptian cultural sins. Yes, including all the Egyptian gods and all the goddesses. And why do you think they made a golden calf, right, when they got to Mount Sinai? Because that was from the Egyptian culture. And of course, they get ingrained and culturalized with all the Egyptian laws and their codes concerning what is right and what's wrong, and how to handle that in the community, and how to deal with that legally and punitively. They're absorbing all this, absorbed from so many different places. And going on in the story, God raises up a prophet named Moses to lead the Israelites out of harsh bondage from Egypt and take them back to their ancient ancestral land, the promised land, back to the land of Canaan that's going to be flowing with milk and honey. And to do so, God tells Moses to tell the Egyptian Pharaoh to let his people go so they can go worship God and to hold a festival. And after all that resistance that Pharaoh, with all the plagues and stuff, and Pharaoh finally lets the Israelites go with Moses, and Moses is at the steering wheel and leads them out of Israel and or out of Egypt and through the Red Sea and so forth. We know that story. And finally, he brings them to Mount Sinai to meet God. Finally, you're standing at Mount Sinai. You've got to imagine what God has to work with here. He's got an entire people group that he's entered into a faith covenant with through Abraham, who have been totally brainwashed by all the cultures surrounding them. And they're brainwashed into believing pretty much everything opposite about who God really is. Pretty much opposite about who God is and what types of things God needs to be pleased and appeased. And they've got this completely wrong idea about how to deal with community transgressions, because they've learned this from all the cultures that they've been conditioned by. This, you guys, this is the state of the Israelites as they left Egypt and they're standing at Mount Sinai. The Israelites have this fallen cultural conditioning going all the way back to when that whole nation started with a man named Abraham, lived way in the pagan town of Ur, way over in southern Iraq. They have all this fallen cultural conditioning when Abraham lived in pagan Canaan, and all the fallen conditioning from living in pagan Egypt for 400 years. Just think about it. These people had all types of false ideas about God, and they had absorbed all of these ungodly conceptions about what's right and what's wrong and how to handle it and how to punish people and how to legally demand of people and how to penally punish people through pain and suffering and even death at times. You've got to imagine the position that God's in when the Israelites are standing at the base of Mount Sinai here, because on one hand, the people are absolutely sinful and have to be corrected on nearly everything about God and how to handle right and wrong and what kind of laws they had. But on the other hand, the only answer to free them from those sins and to give them the accurate picture of who God is wouldn't and could not be realized until the person of Jesus came and would give them that revelation. Get it? Man, God is stuck between a rock and a hard place. And in order to bring Jesus, God has to work with this fallen group of people in the midst of their sin. This means that all God had to work with here was an entire nation who were lost, misinformed, misguided, spiritually dead, who hadn't the foggiest idea of good from evil and how to handle lawbreakers. They had no clue how to judge situations right and act according to the love of God. No idea. And thus, enter God's temporary and culturally accommodated solution. There's temporary solution until Jesus came. The law of Moses. Yup. The law of Moses becomes the vehicle that God uses as an intermediary method, an inaccurate, fallen mechanism to stand in the gap, to work with the people until Jesus could come and set everything straight. And just like in other cases when we see God accommodating and entering into the existing cultural conditioning of the people of the ancient Near East, we find God doing the same thing here when he gives the Israelites the law of Moses. And that's exactly what we're going to go over in the next episode. What we're going to see is that the law of Moses does not represent or display a perfect picture of who God is, nor does it display accurately how God forgives, nor does it correctly display God's methodology for how justice must be served, or what God needs for his anger to be appeased. That's what those on the penal substitutionary atonement side says. See, that's the law. God gave the law, and that's how God must be. No, God's entering into this cultural conditioning, and he's using it to change our actual ideas about God, and until Jesus could come and bring that, this is what God gave them to work through that. The truths about justice and how that works with mercy and laws and how to deal with lawbreakers and consequences, that would not be perfectly revealed until God would come incarnate in the person of Jesus. That's why the Gospel of John says in chapter 1, verse 17, the law came through Moses, but mercy and truth came through Jesus. Truth wasn't in the law. That came through the person of Jesus. Therefore, God would be using this imperfect, this culturally accommodating Mosaic law with its bloody and violent sense of judgment, which really embodied the cultural thinking of the day for those in ancient Near East, to keep the Israelites in a holding pattern until Jesus could come. In many ways, it was a far better law than what the rest of the people of the ancient Near East had. And I'll talk about that more next time, about in what ways specifically. But in other ways, like concerning violence and penal consequences like death for committing community sins, man, this law was not much better at all. So for next time, we're going to dig into some of the ugliness of the law of Moses and see how Jesus corrects the misrepresentations of the law and how Jesus reveals the nature of God through his teachings, ministry, and death on the cross. Yes, Jesus perfectly keeps the commandments pertaining to loving God and loving others self-sacrificially. But we're also going to see how Jesus flips the script on the law of Moses concerning violence, concerning appeasement of wrath, or what we think this wrath that God has. And he's going to flip the script on justice that the law of Moses failed to represent accurately. All that and more on the next episode, guys. We'll see you next time, and be blessed.